The silver locket burned against Coralie's throat as the massive Apache warrior's trembling fingers fumbled with its delicate clasp. She had begged him not to touch it, warned him with desperate whispers, but McCoons couldn't stop himself. The moment their eyes met across the smoky trading post, something ancient and unstoppable had awakened between them. "Please," she whispered again, her voice barely audible above the thunder rolling across the Colorado territory. "You don't understand what it will do to you." But McCoons, whose name meant Little Bear, though he stood 7 feet tall with shoulders broad as a barn door, was already lost. The locket fell open with a soft click, and the photograph inside seemed to glow in the lamplight. His massive frame began to shake, not with fear, but with recognition so profound it shattered every wall he'd built around his heart. The woman in the daguerreotype had Coralie's eyes, the same storm-gray irises that had haunted his dreams for 20 winters. "Impossible," he breathed in his native tongue, then switched to the broken English that connected their worlds. "This woman. She is ... My grandmother," Coralie finished, her own hands trembling as she reached up to touch his weathered cheek. "Evangeline Rousseau. She disappeared from this very town 30 years ago." The trading post around them seemed to fade the shelves of flour and tobacco, the buffalo hides hanging from wooden pegs, the nervous whispers of other customers who'd never seen an Apache warrior show such vulnerability. All that existed was this moment, this impossible connection spanning decades. McCoons's vision blurred as memories that weren't quite his own flooded through him. A young French woman with golden hair running through moonlit woods. The same delicate hands that now touched his face, but belonging to another. Love that transcended language, culture, the very boundaries of what their peoples thought possible. "She came to us willingly," he whispered, his deep voice cracking. "My grandfather ... He spoke of her until his dying breath. The golden-haired woman who chose our ways over her own world." Coralie's breath caught. Her grandmother had vanished without explanation, leaving only whispered rumors and this locket that had passed to Coralie on her 18th birthday. She'd come to Willow Creek seeking answers about her family's past, never expecting to find her future standing before her like a force of nature. "The shaking," she said softly, watching his powerful frame continue to tremble. "It won't stop, will it?" McCoons closed his eyes, the locket still cradled in his palm like sacred medicine. "Not until I understand why the spirits brought you to me, why your face visits my dreams, why touching this small thing feels like touching lightning." Outside, the first fat drops of rain began pattering against the windows. The storm that had been building all day was finally ready to break. Just as the careful control both of them had maintained over their hearts was beginning to crumble. Neither of them knew that Coralie's arrival in Willow Creek hadn't been coincidence at all. The rain hammered the roof of McCoons's cabin as Coralie sat cross-legged on a buffalo hide, watching him pace like a caged mountain lion. He hadn't stopped shaking since opening the locket 6 hours ago, and she could see the effect it was having on his usually iron composure. "Tell me about the dreams," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the storm's fury. He stopped pacing and turned those midnight dark eyes on her. "They began when I reached manhood. Always the same, a woman with hair like spun gold, calling my name across a great distance. She speaks words I cannot understand, but my heart knows their meaning." Coralie's pulse quickened. "What does she say?" "Come home," he whispered. "She says, 'Come home,' in your grandmother's voice." The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls adorned with weapons and medicine bundles. Coralie had followed him here against every rule of propriety, but something deeper than social convention was driving her now. The same force that had guided her grandmother into these very hills decades ago. "My grandmother wrote letters," she said, pulling a weathered journal from her traveling bag. Before she disappeared, the last entry ... She opened to a page marked with pressed wildflowers. She wrote about a dream. A giant warrior who would save her descendants from a fate worse than death. Macoons moved closer, his massive frame casting her in shadow. The shaking had intensified since they'd entered his dwelling, as if proximity to her amplified whatever mystical current flowed between them. "Read it," he commanded softly. Coralie's voice trembled as she spoke her grandmother's words. "The tall one comes in dreams, marked by lightning scars upon his chest. He will know my blood by the silver I wear, and when that silver opens, two hearts separated by time will beat as one. But beware, for he who disturbs the sacred bond will shake until the debt is paid." Lightning chose that moment to illuminate the cabin's interior, and Coralie gasped. Macoons had removed his buckskin shirt, revealing the exact scars her grandmother had described, jagged, white lines that looked like frozen lightning across his broad chest. "The debt," he said hoarsely. "What debt?" Before Coralie could answer, hoofbeats thundered outside despite the storm. Urgent voices called out in English and Spanish, growing closer. Macoons moved to the window, his warrior instincts overriding the mystical trembling that racked his body. "Riders," he growled. "Armed men from town." Coralie's blood turned to ice. "They followed me. I should have known ... She clutched the journal to her chest. "There are people who don't want the truth about my grandmother to come out. People who profited from her disappearance." "What truth?" "She wasn't just some settler woman who ran off with Indians," Coralie said urgently. "She was heir to a mining fortune. When she vanished, her business partner claimed everything. If anyone discovers she lived happily here, had children with your grandfather..." The door exploded inward. 3 men in long coats stood silhouetted against the storm, rifles aimed at them both. The leader's face was cruel and weathered, his eyes cold as January. "Well, well," he sneered. Little Coralie Rousseau, playing house with the savages just like her whore grandmother. Macoons' shaking stopped. Something far more dangerous than mystical tremors now gripped his powerful frame. Pure, lethal rage. The cabin erupted into chaos as Macoons moved with deadly grace despite his enormous size. The first intruder's rifle flew from his hands before he could blink, and Coralie watched in amazement as her gentle giant became something primal and terrifying. "Nobody speaks of her grandmother that way," Macoon snarled, his voice carrying the weight of mountains. But there were 3 of them, and the leader, whom Coralie now recognized as Bartholomew Crane, her grandmother's former business partner, had anticipated Apache fighting skills. The men spread out, keeping their weapons trained on both of them. "Stand down, Chief," Crane spat. "We're not here for you. Just the girl and whatever lies she's been spreading about events that happened before you were born." "Before I was born," Macoons repeated slowly, and Coralie saw understanding dawn in his dark eyes. "But not before my grandfather's time." Crane's confident expression faltered slightly. "Your grandfather's dead and buried. Nothing he might have told you matters now." "Is that what you think?" Macoons took a step forward, and despite having rifles pointed at him, all 3 men instinctively stepped back. "Do you know what my grandfather called your Evangeline?" Coralie held her breath. Even she didn't know this part of the story. "Mijizi Ikwa," Macoons continued, his voice carrying an almost ceremonial cadence. "Eagle woman, because she soared above the petty greed of your kind. Because she chose love over gold, freedom over comfort." "Touching," Crane sneered, but sweat beaded on his forehead. "Doesn't change the fact that she abandoned her legal obligations. The mining operation was forfeit." "The mining operation," Coralie said suddenly, pieces clicking together in her mind, "that you sabotaged to drive the stock prices down." The cave-in that killed 12 men, that wasn't an accident, was it? The youngest of Crane's men, barely out of his teens, paled visibly. Mr. Crane, you said nobody died in the accident. Shut up, Tommy, Crane snapped. But McCunes had heard enough. The mystical trembling that had racked his body since opening the locket suddenly transformed into something else. Entirely a vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The cabin's log walls began to hum in sympathy. Eagle Woman came to my grandfather wounded in spirit, he said, his voice carrying otherworldly resonance. Wounded by the knowledge of what you had done. She carried that burden until the day she died, 30 winters later, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved her. Crane raised his rifle. I don't care about your grandfather's squaw. The girl has documents that could ruin me, and he never finished the sentence. McCunes moved like lightning made flesh, and suddenly Crane was dangling 3 feet off the ground, held aloft by one massive hand around his throat. She was my grandmother's wife, McCunes whispered, and the cabin. Walls shook with the force of his words. My blood flows in her veins. Coralie's world tilted on its axis. The dreams, the trembling, the impossible connection between them, it all made horrifying sense now. You're not strangers, she breathed. We're family, McCunes finished, setting Crane down with surprising gentleness. Which makes what I'm about to do to these men a matter of honor. The storm outside had nothing on the tempest about to break inside that little cabin. The revelation hung in the air like smoke as Coralie struggled to process what McCunes had just revealed. Family. The man whose touch set her soul on fire, whose dreams had called to her across impossible distances, shared her blood through their grandparents' love story. No, she whispered, but even as denial left her lips, her heart recognized the truth. The trembling, the instant recognition, the way every fiber of her being had responded to him. It wasn't romantic love she'd felt, but something deeper and more complex. The call of shared ancestry, of blood calling to blood across the generations. Crane wheezed as he rubbed his throat, his eyes darting between them with calculating malice. Well, ain't that precious? The whole bloodline's tainted with Indian mixing. Tommy, the youngest gunman, lowered his weapon slightly. Mr. Crane, maybe we should just leave them be. If they're kin, they're gonna what, boy? Keep quiet about mass murder? Crane's voice cracked like a whip. The girl's got her grandmother's journal, probably has evidence of the sabotage. And now she's got a trained killer for a cousin. The word cousin sent another shock through Coralie's system. It explained everything and changed everything. The inexplicable pull between them, the way her grandmother's locket had affected him so powerfully, it had been recognizing family, not signaling romance. McCunes stood perfectly still, but Coralie could see the warrior's mind working behind his eyes. The debt your grandmother spoke of, he said quietly. Now I understand. What debt? Crane demanded, though his voice held less confidence than before. The debt of justice, McCunes replied. 12 men died in your sabotaged mine. Their families never knew the truth. Their spirits call for balance. He moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin, with drawing items wrapped in sacred buckskin. When he unwrapped them, Coralie saw her grandmother's handwriting unfolded. Papers, along with what looked like official documents. Eagle Woman didn't just disappear, McCunes said, spreading the papers on the table. She investigated. Gathered proof of your crimes before she came to us for sanctuary. She spent her last 30 years planning for this moment. Crane's face went white as he recognized his own signature on several documents. That's impossible. Those were destroyed in the office fire. Were they? McCunes smiled grimly. Or did a clever French woman make copies before confronting a murderer? The storm outside was beginning to pass, but the tension in the cabin had reached a breaking point. Coralie stared at the documents, seeing evidence of forgery, bribery, and deliberate sabotage laid out in her grandmother's careful script. "She knew you'd come for her descendants eventually," she breathed. "That's why she wrote about the dreams about you. She was preparing me." "Preparing you for what?" Crane snarled. "To finish what she started," McCoons answered. "To see that justice is served for 12 innocent miners and their families." He stood slowly, and in that moment he looked exactly like what he was, a descendant of warriors, raised on stories of honor and justice, carrying the sacred trust of a woman who had chosen love over safety. "You have two choices, Bartholomew." "Crane," he said formally. "Face justice in the white man's courts with this evidence, or face it here, now, in the traditional way." Crane's face twisted with desperate rage. "I choose option 3. He raised his rifle toward Coralie. "The girl dies, the evidence disappears, and you get blamed for murdering white settlers." But he had forgotten something crucial about Apache warriors. They don't just fight for themselves, they fight for family. The rifle shot echoed through the cabin, but it wasn't Crane who had fired. Tommy, the youngest of the 3 men, had turned, his weapon on his employer at the last possible second. Crane crumpled to the floor, clutching his shoulder and howling in pain. "I signed on to collect debts," Tommy said, his young voice shaking but determined, "not to murder women or cover up the deaths of miners. My pay died in a cave-in just like that one." The remaining gunman, a grizzled man named Pete, slowly lowered his weapon. "Tommy's right. This has gone too far, Crane." McCoons moved swiftly to secure Crane's rifle, then knelt beside the wounded man with surprising gentleness. "Your shoulder will heal," he said quietly. 12 miners never got that chance." Coralie gathered the scattered documents, her hands trembling as she realized the magnitude of what her grandmother had preserved. Not just evidence of the mining sabotage, but correspondence proving a conspiracy that reached into the territorial government itself. "There's more," she whispered, reading through pages she'd never seen before. Grandmother documented everything. Other mines, other accidents, a whole network of corruption. McCoons looked up from tending Crane's wound. Eagle Woman was more than just brave. She was planning a war against the men who valued gold over human life. Tommy helped Pete secure Crane with rope from his own saddlebags. "Ma'am, if you've got evidence of other mining murders, there's federal marshals who'd be mighty interested. Clean marshals, not the ones on Crane's payroll." "How do you know about clean marshals?" Coralie asked as the young man's face flushed. "Because my ma's been writing letters for 3 years, trying to get someone to investigate Pa's death. She never gave up believing it wasn't an accident." Something in his voice made McCoons study him more carefully. "What was your father's name?" "Joseph Littlefeather," Tommy replied, then added quietly, "He was half Cheyenne, worked the mines because there wasn't other work that paid enough to feed a family." The cabin fell silent except for Crane's labored breathing and the dying storm outside. Another connection, another thread in the web that Evangeline Rousseau had begun weaving decades ago. "Your father," Coralie said softly, consulting the journal. "He's mentioned here. Grandmother wrote that he was asking questions about the cave-in before he died. She thought he might have been ... silenced." Tommy's jaw tightened. "Ma always suspected. Said he was asking too many questions about the support timbers, about why the company foreman ordered the crew to dig in areas the Apache scouts had warned against." McCoons straightened slowly. "Apache scouts?" "Yes, sir," Tommy nodded. "Company hired local Apache to check for unstable ground. They warned against digging in certain areas, said the earth spirits were angry there. Company ignored the warnings." "Because they wanted the cave-in," Pete said grimly. understanding dawning in his weathered features. Needed it to happen for their plan to work. Coralie felt the final pieces clicking into place. And when the cave-in killed men instead of just disrupting operations, my grandmother couldn't live with staying silent. She came to your people seeking justice and found love instead. Found family, Macoons corrected gently. And now that family will finish what she started. He moved to another chest, withdrawing items that made Tommy's eyes widen with recognition traditional Apache ceremonial objects, but also modern weapons and what looked like official badges. I'm not just a reservation Apache, Macoon said. Quietly, I'm a federal deputy marshal. Have been for 5 years, working to bridge the gap between white and Indian justice. The irony was perfect. Crane had walked into the cabin of the one man uniquely positioned to bring his crimes to light in both worlds. So what happens now? Pete asked. Macoons looked at Coralie, and she saw not romantic love in his eyes, but something equally powerful, the bond of family united in purpose. Now we honor our grandmother's memory, he said simply, and we make sure 12 miners and their families finally get justice. Outside, the storm clouds were breaking apart, allowing the first rays of sunlight to stream through the cabin windows. 3 months later, the courthouse in Denver was packed with families of dead miners, federal marshals, and reporters from as far away as San Francisco. The trial of Bartholomew Crane had become a sensation, not just for the scope of his crimes, but for the unlikely partnership that had brought him to justice. Coralie sat in the front row, wearing her grandmother's silver locket openly for the first time in years. Beside her, Tommy Littlefeather wore his best suit, having been sworn in as a deputy marshal the week before. His mother, a dignified Cheyenne woman with steel in her spine, held his arm proudly at the prosecutor's table. Macoons looked every inch the federal lawman, his massive frame somehow suited to the formal court setting. He had testified for 3 days, presenting evidence with the methodical precision of someone who understood both traditional justice and modern law. The defendant orchestrated the deaths of 12 men, the prosecutor summarized, not through negligence, but through calculated murder designed to manipulate mining stock prices and consolidate power. Crane, pale and thin from months in custody, stared straight ahead. His shoulder had healed, but something fundamental in him had broken the night Tommy Littlefeather chose justice over corruption. The judge, a silver-haired man with kind eyes, reviewed the evidence one final time. The court finds the evidence overwhelming. The documentation preserved by Evangeline Rousseau, combined with testimony from surviving witnesses, paints a clear picture of premeditated murder for financial gain. Coralie closed her eyes, imagining her grandmother's spirit finally at rest. The woman who had sacrificed everything to preserve evidence of these crimes could finally let go of the burden she'd carried for 30 years. Furthermore, the judge continued, this court commends the extraordinary cooperation between civilian investigators and federal law enforcement. The partnership between Deputy Marshal Macoons and Miss Rousseau represents the finest traditions of American justice. After the verdict guilty on all counts, life imprisonment, the courtroom slowly emptied. Families of the dead miners approached Coralie and Macoons with tears and gratitude, finally having answers about their loved ones' deaths. Tommy's mother took Coralie's hands in hers. Your grandmother saved more than just evidence, she said. In accented English, she saved hope. For 30 years I believed my husband was murdered, but no one would listen to an Indian woman. Now his spirit can rest. Outside the courthouse, Coralie and Macoons stood together in the Denver sunshine, no longer trembling with mystical connection, but solid in their shared purpose. What will you do now? He asked. Go back to Willow Creek, she said. Grandmother left me more than evidence. She left me a mining operation to run properly this time. I want to honor the Apache warnings about where to dig, hire local families fairly, make it what it should have been. Macoons nodded approvingly. And I'll return to the reservation, but not as far away as before. Federal marshals need to patrol the mining territories, make sure this never happens again. Family business, Coralie said with a smile. Family business, he agreed. That evening, they stood together at Evangeline Rousseau's grave in the Apache burial ground where she'd been, laid to rest 3 decades ago. The headstone bore her name in both English and Apache, marking her as a bridge between worlds. Tommy approached, carrying wildflowers his mother had picked. Ma wanted you to have these for Eagle Woman's grave. She says grandmothers who fight for justice deserve flowers from grateful families. As they placed the flowers, Coralie felt a strange sense of completion. The trembling that had brought them together, the dreams that had called across generations, the mystical bonds that had seemed like romance, all of it had been leading to this moment of justice and closure. She can rest now, Macoon said quietly. And we can build something better, Coralie added. The sun set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. 3 generations of pain had finally found resolution, and somewhere in the gathering twilight, the spirits of 12 murdered miners could finally walk in peace. 5 years after Bartholomew Crane's conviction, Willow Creek had transformed into something unprecedented in the American West, a mining town where white settlers, Apache, Cheyenne, and mixed-blood families worked side by side in genuine partnership. Coralie stood on the porch of the town's new community center, watching children of various backgrounds play together in the dusty street. The silver locket still hung around her neck, but it no longer trembled with mystical energy. That supernatural connection had served its purpose, bringing justice and healing to multiple generations. The new shaft is producing well, Macoons reported, joining her on the porch. His federal marshal's badge caught the afternoon sunlight. Your grandmother's maps were accurate. The areas she marked as sacred to avoid are exactly where the unstable ore lies. Science and spirituality agreeing, Coralie mused. She would have appreciated that. Their partnership had evolved into something unique in the territory. The Rousseau Mining Company operated under principles that honored both Apache traditions and modern safety standards. Local tribes provided geological knowledge passed down through generations, while Coralie's business acumen ensured fair wages and humane working conditions. Tommy Littlefeather approached, leading a group of new miners, men and women of various backgrounds who'd come seeking honest work in a place where heritage mattered less than character. His deputy marshal badge reflected the same sunlight as his mentors. The afternoon shift is ready, he reported. And ma'am, there's a delegation from the territorial capital wants to meet with you about expanding the partnership model to other mining operations. Coralie nodded. They'd expected this. The success of Willow Creek had attracted attention throughout the West, proving that cooperation between different peoples could be both profitable and sustainable. What do you think, cousin? She asked Macoons, using the family term that had replaced their initial romantic confusion. Ready to change the world? He smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. I think Eagle Woman would say, we already have. That evening, the community gathered in the center for their weekly shared meal, tradition that had grown organically from their multicultural workforce. Apache elders shared stories while Irish miners played fiddles. Children of mixed heritage bridged conversations between their various grandparents, and everyone contributed food from their cultural traditions. Coralie sat beside Mrs. Littlefeather, who had become like an adopted mother to her. Do you think our grandmothers could have imagined this? She asked, gesturing at the harmonious scene before them. The Cheyenne woman considered the question seriously. I think they saw it in dreams, she said finally. Your Eagle Woman and my husband's spirit, they knew their suffering would plant seeds, were just the harvest they believed in. After the meal, Coralie and McCoons walked to the small cemetery where Evangeline's grave was, now surrounded by others miners who had died of age and accident rather than murder, their families. Able to grieve openly and heal completely. "I had the dream again last night," McCoons said quietly. "The old one?" "No, a new one." He paused beside his grandmother's headstone. "I saw children not yet born, growing up in a world where Apache scouts and Irish engineers and Chinese railroad workers and Mexican vaqueros all contribute their knowledge to building something none of them could create alone." Coralie smiled. "Sounds like grandmother's vision expanding." "Or maybe," he said, looking at her with eyes that held deep familial affection, "it's our vision now. The next generation's responsibility." As they stood together in the gathering, darkness, surrounded by the sounds of a thriving community settling down for the night, Coralie felt the profound satisfaction of a promise kept. The trembling that had begun with opening a silver locket had led not to romance, but to something rarer and more lasting, the healing of old wounds and the creation of new possibilities. The stars emerged over Willow Creek, shining down on a place where different worlds had learned to build together rather than apart. And somewhere in that starlight, the spirits of those who had sacrificed for justice could finally rest in peace, knowing their legacy lived on in every child who played without seeing differences, every worker who was valued for their contribution, every family that had found home in a place built on hope rather than hatred. The giant Apache had stopped shaking years ago. Now he helped others find their own balance, their own way to stand steady in a world that was slowly learning to make room for everyone.